have seen many a person attempt to violate the Constitution of the United States. It's almost become like a game. You know, we certainly see people try and violate the word of the Supreme Court. You can't have any more moratoriums on evictions. Well, let's just keep it going, said Joe Biden. You can't pay off people's student loan debt. Well, let's just try it, said Joe Biden. It happens again and again. And then you see other things kind of happen. The idea of just, well, seeing what you can get away with. Is that what we're really seeing in New Mexico? Is that the story here? Guys, welcome to the show presented by Americans for Prosperity, AmericansForProsperity.org, economic liberty, free speech. That is where it's at. This was the headline. New Mexico governor orders suspension of open and concealed carry of guns in Albuquerque. What in the bloody heck is she talking about? Let me bring in Guy Relford. He is a Second Amendment attorney by trade. Relford Law is where you find him. And Guy, I want to just start with exactly what she said. I have this video. It's sometimes a little hard to hear, but it's what I have, where she's explaining, this is Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham, Democrat from New Mexico, explaining why she has the right to suspend open and concealed carry because, as she says it, no right is absolute. Listen.
With one exception, and that is if there's an emergency, and I've declared an emergency for a temporary amount of time, I can invoke additional powers. No constitutional right, in my view, including my oath, is intended to be absolute. There are restrictions on free speech. There are restrictions on my freedoms. In this emergency, this 11-year-old and all these parents who have lost all these children, they deserve my attention to have the debate about whether or not in an emergency we can create a safer environment. Because what about their constitutional rights? I took an oath to uphold those too. And if we ignore this growing problem without being bold, I've said to every other New Mexican, your rights are subrogated to theirs. And they are not, in my view.
That is a pretty remarkable thing to hear, Guy Relford, that my oath is not absolute. But the Constitution is, correct?
Well, yeah, it is shocking. And, I've been talking about this quite a bit on social media, but, she has one thing more or less correct. She says constitutional rights are not absolute. And you hear a lot of politicians quote the language even out of the Heller decision that found that there is an individual right to bear arms protected by the Second Amendment. And Justice Scalia, in that opinion, said, our opinion here, finding there's an individual right to bear arms should not be taken to mean that right is completely unrestricted. And long-held limitations, upheld limitations on the right to bear arms are not set aside by this opinion. And so politicians like this governor will seize on that language and basically try to argue, as she just did, that because a right is not completely unrestricted, that I can impose whatever restrictions I want. And that's not how that works. And we got great clarity on this point just last June from the Supreme Court in the Bruin decision. And in Bruin, it said, listen, whether a particular limitation on a right is constitutional or not is determined by the text of the constitutional freedom we're talking about. In other words, what do the words mean? What does it protect? And then secondly, does the proposed restriction, is that consistent with the long history and tradition of the regulation of this right in this country, going all the way back to the founding and before? And in that same Bruin decision, Tony, as you well know, because we've talked about it and you've talked about it independently, that the Bruin court at the Supreme Court said specifically that the right to bear arms, that is to carry a firearm outside the home, is a fundamental right protected by the Second Amendment, and that the text, history, and tradition test that handed down in Bruin applied to the issue of whether you can carry a gun in public very, very, very clearly. And this was a 6-3 opinion. comes out in favor of the right to bear arms outside the home. So we just had the Supreme Court last June, barely a year ago, come out and say the right to bear arms outside the home is protected and a proposed restriction on it is unconstitutional. And even New York's licensing system that allowed some people to carry a handgun and other people not, right, under a discretionary licensing system, was unconstitutional. How in the world, where a limitation that said only some people not having the ability to carry guns outside the home was unconstitutional, does this governor think that she can get away with a total ban on carrying firearms? It's ludicrous if you have any understanding of what the Supreme Court said on this issue.
Let's take a moment. I mean, this was how CNN reported it, that the emergency order includes the suspension of open and concealed carry laws in Albuquerque and I think it's Bernalillo County, temporarily banning the carrying of guns on public property with certain exceptions, according to the statement. And she refers to it as a public health emergency. It reminds me of the Clint Eastwood movie where you had to give up your guns when you walked into town. I don't know if it was Unforgiven. Was that it? I think I got it right. Gene Hackman. Yeah. Unforgiven. I think the story here that kind of got people, that kind of shocked people, was the idea of public health emergency. I had Congressman Ted Lieu, who is a progressive. I had David Hogg, who is this manufactured celebrity in the anti-gun movement, both saying a public health measure or a public health emergency doesn't strip away the Constitution, doesn't supersede the Constitution, which is weird because they totally thought that way vis-a-vis COVID, but now all of a sudden they don't. They happen to be correct. Is the public health emergency just the new way to try and get someone's desires, anti-Second Amendment desires, accomplished?
Well, it is. It's an attempted way around not being able to get legislation passed that restricts our Second Amendment rights. So executives in the executive branch, including through their health departments, have said, we'll just issue emergency orders under an alleged public health emergency. But one thing's been very clear, and we had courts all over the country rule this way in the context of COVID, Tony, that you brought up, which is, for instance, where the government tried to say you couldn't go to the church or synagogue or other place of worship of your choice to worship during COVID. We had courts all over the country strike those restrictions down to say, no, I'm sorry, the free exercise of religion is the free exercise of religion. And let's face it, I mean, if the government can suspend the Constitution in any emergency to curtail your rights, the government will create an emergency in order to curtail your rights. That's not how the Constitution works. The Constitution doesn't say, unless there's an emergency, the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. And so it doesn't work that way. You can't just say, emergency, the Constitution doesn't exist anymore. The Constitution was meant to be enforced even in an emergency.
So let's go back to something, because I often, when I refer to the Second Amendment, I'm not a gun guy. Talking to Guy Relford, relfordlaw.com, Second Amendment attorney, host of the Gun Guy Show on 93.1 FM WIBC. He's written books about firearms. He trains people on firearms. And I am very clear to admit that I am not a gun guy. I'm a Second Amendment guy. I'm not a gun guy. These are fundamentally different things. You are a Second Amendment guy and a gun guy, trained lawyer as you are. When we talk about rights, right, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, as the Second Amendment says, that sounds like something that is absolute. But we were discussing, and you were mentioning earlier, that rights are not necessarily absolute. How do you answer that question when asked? Are rights absolute?
Well, in my heart of hearts, Tony, I say the rights are 100% absolute. And when the Constitution and the Second Amendment says specifically the right to bear arms shall not be infringed, then that's what the founders meant. However, the Supreme Court disagrees with me on that point, and that's the law of the land. And as an attorney, I'm being misguided, and I'm not being true to my clients if I don't direct people toward what the state of the law is today. And the unmistakable truth is the Supreme Court, as Justice Scalia said in the Heller decision, has said that the right to bear arms is not unrestricted completely and totally. For instance, if we went to court tomorrow and challenged the restriction that said a violent felon cannot possess a firearm under state or federal law, we would lose that appeal. And if our argument was, oh no, the Second Amendment is absolute, which again, in my heart of heart, I believe to be true, the courts disagree with me. The Supreme Court has disagreed with me. The Indiana courts have disagreed with me on that point. They say, no, violent felons, violent criminals have long been restricted or prohibited from carrying firearms in this country, going all the way back to the founding and before, including under English law. Therefore, that's a restriction that survives a constitutional challenge. So while I believe constitutional rights are absolute, not just the Second Amendment, but others as well, the courts have clearly disagreed with me on that point, and that's the state of the law today.
So we've taken a look at what's happening there in New Mexico. People are already rallying, carrying their firearms. They're not going to pay any attention to this, that the governor is completely out of her tree. This idea that somehow an oath is not absolute, and she owes it to the people to try and save them by restricting people's rights. The NRA has come out against this. Others have come out against this. Does this even require lawsuits, even though I know they've already taken place? Or is this the kind of thing where the Supreme Court could just look at it, and I don't know who oversees things in New Mexico, that'd actually be a more of like the circuit courts, but someone could say, yeah, this ain't going to fly. Does the Supreme Court act proactively here, or are they going to wait for something to come to them?
Yeah, they've got to wait for something to come to them. It's just the way the system works. But a lower court can issue a preliminary injunction very, very quickly. And I anticipate that happening, depending, of course, on what court we're talking about. But the Supreme Court really can't just weigh in, even with something as egregious as this, because this is clear. Again, anybody who reads the Bruin decision just came down last June and thinks that this is constitutional is crazy. And the idea that an emergency somehow validates it just doesn't hold true for anybody who's looked at this area of the law.
Which brings us to why in the world she would do it. Look, as far as I'm concerned, progressives believe things that I don't believe. And some progressives get very radical. And when your ideology supplants your humanity, it will supplant all things. And you believe because you want something to be true or you want something to happen, you can go about doing it and damn the rest. This is one of those things that you knew that the pushback would be immediate. And it made me wonder, especially when I saw Representative Ted Lieu, when I saw David Hogg with literally almost the same response about public health emergencies, I said, that's weird. Like they're on the same page. So here's my question to you. Go full conspiracy theory with me, Guy Relford. Full on tinfoil hat. Is this a test balloon? Is this a way of saying, hey, exactly what could we get away with here? We got away with it with COVID, and we locked people down, and we closed businesses, and we closed churches. What can we get away with here? And is that even a rational point of view?
Well, I could see someone, on a broader scale, interested in gun control, like the Brady campaign, or Moms Demand Action, or one of the other Bloomberg groups. And I could see a group like that saying, "Hey, yeah, let's run a test here," because they've been talking about regulating firearms under a declared public health emergency for a long time. We've heard that discussed right here in central Indiana, in Marion County. We've heard it discussed all over the country to say, yeah, look what we did get away with in the context of COVID. Why don't we direct this at the Second Amendment, because we can't get anything like a so-called assault weapons ban through the legislature. And so it could be that, but my immediate reaction, Tony, while that could very well still be true, it may also be true that in the shorter term, she just thinks this is a way to get votes in her next election. Just like we had, and it's a perfect analog, just like we had the mayor of Indianapolis say he's going to completely ban the concealed carry of firearms in Marion County. Licenses notwithstanding, state law notwithstanding, he wants to ban it completely. Both the Republican and the Democrat here in Marion County say they want to roll back constitutional carry. Why did they do any of that? Because they think it gets them votes in the next election. I think they're wrong, particularly with respect to the Republican. He's incredibly wrong, and he's about to be educated rather emphatically on that point in the election. Having said that, I think this is just pandering to a base that they think earns them votes at the end of the day. However, whether that's true or not, if this is successful in Albuquerque / New Mexico, you can definitely expect to see it pop up all over the country, and including right here in Marion County. I absolutely believe that to be true.
Yeah, I don't have a conspiratorial bone in my body. Never, ever, ever, ever. Yet I've seen enough to make me say that these things happen for a reason. Hey, we should do away with gas stoves. Hey, leave my gas stove alone. Hey, no one's coming for your gas stove. Why are you saying? It's just all part of ugly pattern. Guy Relford, relfordlaw.com. Also check out the 2A Project, 2aproject.com to see what he's doing on the Second Amendment. You could be a part of that and join 2A Project, number 2, letter A, 2aproject.com. Guy Relford, I appreciate you. And thank you guys so much for being a part of what we do over here. And my thanks to Americans for Prosperity, AmericansForProsperity.org. Economic liberty, free speech. That is what it's all about. Love the group. Check them out. We don't agree on everything, but man, do they believe that you and me and Guy Relford and everyone else should have a right to speak. That makes them good enough in my book. I appreciate you guys, and I will catch you next time. Take care.